I'd like to introduce Dr. Chris Timmermann, who has a BSc in psychology and an MSc in neuroscience and is a postdoc at the Imperial College London Center for Psychedelic Research. There he leads the DMT research group, and they study the effects of psychedelics, especially DMT, on the human brain and consciousness. Chris's empirical and theoretical work focuses on the neuroscience, psychiatry, psychology, pharmacology, beliefs and ethics of psychedelics, and their relationship to consciousness and applications in mental health. Also, Chris's work has been covered extensively in media, and if I recall correctly, at our last Insight Conference 2021, you received the Best Basic Research Award, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, that was very nice. I remember that.
Great. Let's see. Again, we'll have a vote this year. I introduced it to the audience earlier today. So again, a reminder to everyone, please vote tonight. You'll get an email. And our tech team, you need to just make him a host, then he can share his screen. Host or co-host. I see. So that would be Irene most likely. Yeah. Sorry for the hold-up, everyone. Is this happening? Let's see. Well, I'm not exactly in the position to start texting on WhatsApp right now. Now, Chris, as host, can you try again to share your screen?
Okay. I can share now, yeah.
Yes, wonderful.
Yeah.
Okay, we see our Outlook, and now it's the PPT. Okay, perfect. Then please, go ahead.
Great. I hope you can all hear me well. Please do let me know if not. Fortunately, I cannot be there today. I am in London, stuck in London, but yeah, it would be great to be there. So most of my research actually focuses on the neurobiology of psychedelics, especially with DMT, and some also phenomenological research, how that relates to human experience. And today I'm going to speak about trying to gather some of that data and information, trying to see if we can somehow answer the central question of how can psychedelics provide insights or advance the field of consciousness research. And I'd like to start with this kind of like this perennial sort of phrase sentence that has propelled a lot of psychedelic research and contemporary research. This quote by Stanislav Grof, the idea that LSD as well as other psychedelics act as catalysts or amplifiers of mental processes. So if we use them properly, we could somehow use them as microscope or telescopes for the mind. They could somehow reveal something about the mind, structures about the mind and the relationship to brain activity. And at the same time, on the other side of that question is the intuition that somehow the psychedelic experience is not necessarily revealing something fundamental about consciousness, but that many times for users, that is an apparent feeling. There's no quality of sorts. Today, I'd like to propose that psychedelics act by modulating fundamental structures of experience. And by modulating, I refer to that they enable the deconstruction and reconstruction of representations, beliefs, thoughts, emotions, and ideas. And via this modulation, we are able to study fundamental aspects of the mind and the relationship to brain processes. So what do I mean by deconstruction? The idea would be that psychedelics would perturb the taken for granted construction of human experience. They would perturb our naive realism of sorts, this idea that somehow we have a perception of the external world or environment, and the way that our representations shape that external environment is somehow transparent to us. That process is invisible usually to us. And that somehow psychedelics, by perturbing this form of naive realism, might enable forms of opacification, of visibilizing these representations that mediate the active role that the brain and the mind have in shaping our experience of the world and of ourselves. So with colleagues, we have proposed that this form of naive realism is similar somehow to the concepts of natural latitude and phenomenology, cognitive fusion in a clinical context and in models of cognitive behavioral therapy, the ACT model, reification, absorption, and forms of subjective realism. And somehow psychedelics would enable forms of awareness or opacification of these processes. The idea would be that this deconstruction is a means to gain awareness of the mind of sorts. So by perturbing the usual way that we experience the world, we can become aware of how we usually construct experience. So this would enable a shift from, let's say, a natural attitude of naive realism to a phenomenological disposition, a way in which we bracket our assumptions of the world, and we can investigate, we can inquire about these structures of the mind. In the context of clinical practice, this move would entail a move from a cognitive fusion in which we are fused with our thoughts and our emotions, our representations about ourselves, to forms of cognitive diffusion, being able to stand back, take distance with regards to these thought experiences, beliefs, and emotions. Or from the view of transparency or opacity, we could opacify structures of the mind, somehow become aware of certain representations that govern our experience of the world and of ourselves. Under the predictive processing model, we can understand this as deconstructing models of the world and of ourselves or experience. The essential idea under the predictive processing hypothesis would be that our normal experience of the world is a form of constrained hallucination. It's governed by models which are instantiated in a hierarchical fashion in the brain. Hierarchical in the sense that at the top of this hierarchy, we would have these sort of like hyper priors or hyper models or beliefs about the world that somehow constrained our intuitive physics about how things operate in the environment. Also at this high level of the hierarchy would have models concerning the sense of self and so on. And that these higher level models constrain brain processes all the way down. The idea under the rebus hypothesis proposed by Carhart, Harris, and Friston is that psychedelics would relax the precision of these high-level models, allowing novel informations and worlds of experience to unfold more freely in experience, thereby deconstructing these models. And we have some evidence suggesting that this is the case. So for example, the most replicated finding in contemporary psychedelic research is the idea that psychedelics would reduce the power of alpha oscillations. And other research has shown that these alpha oscillations that can be measured via EEG are related to the top-down influence of high-level models on brain activity. We have found specifically that, for example, in DMT experiences, the intensity of that experience is anti-correlated with alpha oscillations, meaning that the stronger the psychedelic experience, the less the influence of alpha power, and therefore the instantiation of these high-level models of the world on brain activity. Parallelly, in fMRI studies, we found in a few studies already that psychedelics appear to fairly reliably disintegrate high-level networks. These networks would correspond to the default mode network and the frontoparietal network. The default mode network, a network involved in the encoding of self-related processing or models pertaining to the sense of self, as well as social relations and so on. Very much models related to the way that culture is also instantiated in the brain and in our experience of the world. Essentially providing evidence for this idea that these high-level models, these high-level representations are somehow deconstructed in the psychedelic experience. A good example of this is this notion that the this sense of self, it can be also deconstructed in lower levels or double level models, such as a narrative sense of self or a bodily sense of self. And we have evidence in psychedelic studies, fMRI studies, for example, showing how scores of ego dissolution are related to a decoupling of high-level systems in the brain with the rest of the brain, or a hyperconnectivity of certain brain areas related to bodily self-processing with the rest of the brain as well, somehow indicating that there's a modulation of these high-level systems, which is somehow related to these scores of ego dissolution. And in recent unpublished data, we've also found how there are biological markers related to the processing of interoceptive self-awareness or the bodily self that also appear to be significantly dampened in DMT experiences. So this is the heart evoked potential. It's an evoked potential that occurs in the brain on every single heartbeat and has been related to interoceptive awareness. So this evidence appears to suggest that after the administration of DMT, this heart evoked potential is significantly reduced, somehow indicating that the experience of ego dissolution might be related also to a deconstruction of these more core or fundamental aspects of self-awareness related to interoception. And then an intriguing way that we can understand the study of the mind and how it can be advanced with the use of psychedelics is the substance 5-methoxy-DMT. So 5-MeO-DMT, unlike regular DMT or NN-DMT, appears to induce a state of contentless experience. The most evident aspect of 5-MeO-DMT in this regard is its lack of visual experiences that it induces. So many users of 5-MeO-DMT report this experience of a whiteout, which, unlike DMT, which is very filled and rich with contents of experience and visuals, would be contrary to what is happening in this 5-MeO-DMT experience, in which our qualitative research appears to indicate that the experience that people are usually left at, or a common experience that people report, is simply the feeling of being alive, some form of awareness of some form of homeostatic mechanisms that remains once you deconstruct all models or all other more complex models about the mind. And this appears to be somewhat similar to what has been proposed with non-dual states of meditation, that in these immersive meditative states, users report a deconstruction of these models or these constructs that govern our day-to-day experience into some form of more fundamental state. This what has been proposed also by Thomas Metzinger to be corresponding to a minimal phenomenal experience. So this is an intriguing avenue for consciousness research, the possibility that we can somehow deconstruct the complexity of the models and representations that govern our day-to-day experiences into their more fundamental aspects. While psychedelics appear to be inducing these forms of deconstruction, and we have increasing amount of evidence showing this or indicating or suggesting this, it is also very plausible that psychedelics act as tools of reconstruction, of instantiating novel models or representations of experience. So, for example, there's quite a lot of psychometric evidence suggesting that psychedelics are amplifiers of meaning. They increase the attribution of truth, experiences feeling more real than real, that they can reify certain notions or make experiences feel less real, that can have an enduring effect, right? So increasing forms of transparency, if we want to put it as well, we somehow are not necessarily more aware of these deconstructive elements that govern our day-to-day experiences, but somehow we are seeing through them in a more intense fashion. A good example of this is the noetic quality of psychedelic experiences that has also been reported for other drug states, as well as spiritual-like experiences that occur spontaneously. A good example of this, and why I think I was particularly interested in this idea of reconstruction, is because in DMT states, forms of reconstruction appears to be quite apparent. A good example of it is the feeling of encountering entities, a feeling of immersion into an alternate dimension or reality, essentially posing this idea, this notion that DMT states appear to be fairly unique in how they can induce a form of virtual reality that appears to trick the mind in terms of thinking that this is an actual real experience, that this is an actual thing that is real in the external environment. And these are some of the drawings of our participants in our DMT studies, somehow illustrating this reification of these different objects and structures of experience. I would also argue that a paradigmatic example of forms of reconstruction is the unitive experience that occurs in psychedelic states. This quality, the other side of the coin, in a way, if psychedelics appear to induce these forms of ego dissolution, a deconstruction of the sense of self, it seems as novel, a novel construction of identity appears to be occurring, in which, you know, the identity of the individual can be now connected with the wider world or wider objects of experience or nature, for example. Another form in which we can think of both a modulation of both deconstruction and reconstruction can be happening at this level of hyperpriors, or of these high-level models that are instantiated in brain activity, for example, in metaphysical beliefs. So we have evidence, for example, that psychedelics appear to reduce beliefs in physicalism, meaning a form of deconstruction of these high-level models. But at the same time, we find increases in panpsychism, or the belief that everything is conscious in the universe. So while there's a form of deconstruction of the prior belief, there's a reconstruction of a novel hyperprior or novel belief. So intriguingly, we don't have much evidence for how these forms of reconstruction are happening in the brain, but we have some guesses. So for example, in our DMT experiments, we found that while these alpha power goes down, and while also these high-level networks are disintegrated, implying some form of deconstruction, we find that there's an increased power of delta waves and hyperconnectivity of limbic areas. And this increases in delta waves are occurring particularly at the peak of that psychedelic experience, somehow suggesting that when the more immersive quality of the DMT experience is occurring, these forms of reconstruction may also be occurring somehow instantiated by increased power in delta waves. And we have some neurophenomenological evidence suggesting that this increase in delta and theta waves are related to the immersive visual experience that occurs in the DMT experience. Now, intriguingly, in dream states, the increased power in these delta and theta waves has been associated to cortical originators in temporal lobe areas of the brain that are related to memory and emotion, somehow allowing this construction of these novel worlds of experience. In predictive processing terms, the hypothesis that I would be proposing here is that by reducing the influence of these high-level models that constrained all lower-level models, these medium-level models that are instantiated in this memory and limbic systems become more pronounced, allowing forms of reconstruction of novel worlds of experience occurring in DMT states. So to go back to the initial idea, psychedelics would enable some form of advance in the study of consciousness by modulating structures of experience, and thereby allowing us to understand how in everyday experience, we're always in a process of deconstruction and reconstruction of these representations. And that all down to the level of more elementary perception, these forms of deconstruction or reconstruction are occurring, albeit in more subtle ways. However, most empirical studies have shown data which is much more consistent with forms of deconstruction. And therefore, we are lacking this other side of the coin. How is it that in the psychedelic experience, there is also forms of reconstruction? And I would argue that this is somehow related to the way in which we do science. We do scientific practice related to psychedelics. So a conventional approach in which we do science, not just in psychedelic science, but also in many other forms of neuroimaging, is that we would have an experience as particular state A. So you would have an experiential representation here in the quadrant above. the psychedelic experience would perturb that state A, leading to a state B, an altered state of consciousness of sorts. The way that we do neuroimaging is that we look at the neural correlates of state A and compare them to that of state B. And by doing that, we average across all experiences of all individuals. And we also average across time. We tend to think of the psychedelic experience as this single average moment. I would suspect that what is happening here is that we are averaging out all the richness of subjective experience and also these moments of reconstruction of experience that can be occurring. So with colleagues, we have proposed a neurophenomenological approach in which we seek to investigate the richness of human experience by inviting first-person methods in the lab, qualitative methods that are mediated via rigorous interviewing. Ideally, by doing this, we're able to characterize the fluctuation of the psychedelic experiences, of different psychedelic experiences, identifying substates that can be occurring in which these forms of reconstruction of experience can become more habitual or more somehow we can identify them. And therefore, when we identify these substates of experience, we may be able to characterize also the relationship to brain processes, allowing us to understand better how is it that we are not just deconstructing aspects of experience in psychedelic states, but also reconstructing novel worlds of experience. And before I finish, I'd like to mention what are the possible implications for psychedelic therapy. So, according to Chris, who just spoke now, a big part of his argument, it could be said that psychedelics would work in psychedelic therapy by enabling forms of opacification or deconstruction. So the proposal is that, for example, mystical states, the underlying quality of mystical state, is that one related to the phenomenology of ego dissolution, deconstructing the sense of self. In a complementary fashion, Aidan Lyon has proposed that psychedelics would enable forms of transparency. So that transparency or forms of reconstruction can also be quite useful in psychedelic therapy. A good example of this is, for example, the important influence that unitive experiences appear to be having in therapeutic processes. I would complement these claims by proposing that ethical psychedelic practice and efficacious psychedelic practice would increase the flexibility of deconstruction and reconstruction of structures of experience, thereby in the long term somehow aiding in the development of a gentle touch concerning insights. The idea would be that somehow what would be cultivated in the process of psychedelic therapy is enabling the individual to have freedom to move between forms of deconstruction or opacification of structures of experience and reconstruction or transparency whenever that is needed in the therapeutic process. And the reason why this is important is because there appears to be also not just meaningful and helpful insight in psychedelic experiences, but there's also quite a lot of noise. Examples of this is the potential appearance of false memories or unhelpful psychological insights or troubling insights that can occur in the process of psychedelic therapy. And we have given some examples of this in a recent publication with Rosalind Watts and David Dupuy. And we also argue that the way to somehow navigate this is by fostering forms of experiential know-how that can help mitigate these risks and potentially promote true or helpful insights in the process of psychedelic therapy. A good way to understand this would be to do a bit of an analogy with learning how to surf. When an individual is learning how to surf, the individual is confronted with an ocean, which is flooded with unstructured signal, right? There's a lot of waves, and there's a big part of surfing is really learning how to understand what is a wave and what is not a wave. And at the beginning, that is not clear. The only way to really learn that is by having an embodied relationship with being in the ocean and learning to see the signal in the noise, and when that signal is helpful and when it's unhelpful. So in a similar way, when learning how to do psychedelic experiences or in unmediated psychedelic experiences, the unmediation may lead to more unstructured noise or misidentify noise as signal in therapeutic process. So misidentify, for example, insights as being completely real or sometimes having experiences of confusion that could somehow be conceived of as meaningful experiences whenever the case is needed. The essential idea is that mediation, especially intersubjective mediation with an experienced therapist or guide, can help aid the individual to have an embodied relationship with that experience and an identifying signal in that noise whenever it's needed. So going back to the fundamental question of whether or not psychedelics can provide insights into consciousness in therapy and in science, is that it really depends on the way that we enact psychedelic practice, therapeutic practice, and scientific practice. And that's the end. I'd like to just acknowledge all my collaborators in the DMT research group, the Center for Psychedelic Research, and external collaborators. So thank you for your attention.
Just like I repeat myself when I say thank you, Chris, for this very insightful talk. It's great to have philosophical discussions based on neuroscience. I see a question here in the back. Do we have questions for Jose online? Still not yet, but there are questions here in the room.
Thanks, Chris. My question was with the psychedelic apprenticeship, this concept. I haven't fully read the paper. I've started it, but stopped. That's my own problem. But you might have said it in the paper. But are you referring to psychedelic apprenticeship as in the person who is undergoing psychedelic psychotherapy, like they need experiential know-how? Or are you referring to the actual practitioner, and is that kind of in favor or supporting the notion that psychedelic practitioners should have their own experiential know-how in order to guide people? And are you like, is that sort of an explicit stance? I know it's a bit of a controversial topic sometimes.
Thank you for the question. In the paper, we actually argue for both this form of experiential know-how. And so we would argue that from the point of view of psychedelic therapy, essentially what lies at the core of this idea of apprenticeship is that it's a second person approach, and therefore it's the intersubjective mediation of that psychedelic experience by someone who has undergone a similar process and knows the opportunities and pitfalls of the psychedelic experience, can somehow provide gradual orientation in the process of becoming aware, for example, of pacifying structures of the mind whenever it's needed in the process of psychedelic processes. So that happens at the level of the therapeutic relationship. And we have increasing evidence suggesting that, for example, therapeutic alliance predicts positive outcomes in the process of psychedelic therapy, somehow supporting that idea, which is also an intuitive idea in all forms of psychotherapy as well. Now, from the point of view of the practitioner, this would imply that they need to also have that form of or some form of apprenticeship in their own preparation as a psychedelic guide. And that the intuitive hypothesis would be that, yes, an essential part of that is a skillfully mediated psychedelic experience of their own as well, also with another person who can provide gradual orientation in that process. The idea would be that, effective psychedelic practice would be embedded in larger lineages of psychedelic practice. I also think it's an empirical question, and it's a very important empirical question. And a way that we can assess this is really try to see how different trainings that involve psychedelic practitioners having their own psychedelic experience versus not having their experiences, and then looking at their outcomes with their patients.
Okay, we have time for one more. Yeah, please. I don't think I can walk over.
Hi, thank you for your talk. Okay, I've got like two questions really. First is, I've read your paper about sense of familiarity in DMT experiences from this year. And there, if I understood it well, you suggest that maybe there could be, this could be telling us is that there are some kind of circuits or networks that are related to feeling familiar with things in general. So I'm interested in this sense of hyper-reality that you also have in DMT trips, there might be also kind of natural circuits that gives us the feeling of truth. And then, what will be truth? Just a feeling. And part two of the question, what do you think that's the philosophical interpretation of Ribas' model? Are we looking at the Kantian noumenic chaos and things as they are? And how do you link this to phenomenology that you support? That's it.
Well, I have a very agnostic stance on it, but I think that intuitively, so whether or not there's a specific button in the brain that you're pressing and therefore providing this noetic feeling of truth that is happening in the psychedelic experience, or the feeling of familiarity, of whether or whether or not this feeling of familiarity and of truth arises because there's such a strong deconstructive process that is occurring in the psychedelic experience that is somehow revealing some form of more core experience. I think it's an open question based on the evidence that I proposed. There is space for that possibility as well, that somehow these noetic feelings can also be arising because there's a deconstruction of these more complex models, and there's a more essential quality of experience that is arising, and that is being identified as a true experience. Now, how that translates into content and the reports of the psychedelic experience after it has occurred, I think is a different process, a process of filling in which cultural constructs can be very much influential in the way that people make meaning out of that, and what is it that they are attributing as being truth. And with regards to the deeper ontological question, I think there's not enough time for me to answer that, and yeah, I don't have any sort of like very defined positions, I think.
I'm sorry, we cannot accept another question. We're already 5 minutes over. Thank you, Chris. I know we're far from the end of the discussions on epistemology, ontology, and psychedelics, but I think today was a great start. We have another day of conference ahead of us. I wish you a great time, and thanks for tuning in from London, Chris.
Thank you very much.